It's really an honor to be here with all of you tonight. I love what the Build students have been doing. And I think just in the room tonight, I'd like to see hands. I know that we've honored a lot of people. But if you've been involved with Build, if you've been a student in Build, if you've dedicated service to Build hours as an adult, or if you've sponsored a Build project, I want you to raise your hand. Look around the room. That is absolutely incredible. So together, I want to say that we change lives and we save lives. And I've been honored to work with Build in places like Yemen and Lebanon and Jordan and Iraq. And I have a couple of your clinics right now in Jordan and Yemen. But students from Build have also helped me do many more things throughout the year. So I want to talk about some of those tonight, and I want to introduce some of the people, oh yeah, we got it, that you've helped over the last year. But I want to start by telling you a story. I want to start with a moment that I will absolutely never forget. I was here, high in the remote mountains of Iraq, really just a few miles from the Iranian and the Turkish border. And it was a gorgeous day, and I was sitting with a small family in their home, women and children, and we were talking about what their needs were in this area. But suddenly, it turned into one of the most terrifying moments of my life. Armed men burst through the door, and a bit of chaos ensued. Women and children quickly scurried out of the room, and I had no idea what was going on. I just knew that these men were frontline fighters because they wore bulletproof vests and they carried machine guns. And I was absolutely terrified. Now, I'm a mom of 3. How in the world did I end up here? Well, that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about tonight. I want to talk to you about that journey. As you can see, I emerged unscathed. I'm fine. But how I ended up there and my journey since is what I'd like to speak with you about tonight. I like to share my photos through stories. And they help me tell the story just a little bit more vividly. My journey began just a couple of years ago, believe it or not, in 2014, when I took a trip that I had never imagined taking. And through that experience, I discovered a few things that both surprised me and changed my life. And I want to share those with you tonight because my hope is that after I share them, that they might change your life too. But to understand why this journey is so important to me, you have to understand a little bit about where I come from. Now, I was born in Missouri, and I was raised on the West Coast, primarily in Oregon and California. And we were a super big family. When I graduated from college with a degree in Management of Human Resources and Operations Management, I met my husband, Clint, pictured here. And he was a pediatric nurse. And together we had huge dreams that we would one day change the world, that we would one day start medical clinics in underprivileged nations. Now that was 25 years ago. 27 years ago. And so we actually applied ourselves. We did all of our education, we did our Arabic study. I went to work for a small medical nonprofit that specialized in sending medical teams around the world. So just so I could learn the ropes of how you get doctors and nurses into disaster areas. But in the midst of that, in the midst of all of that learning and all of that effort, my husband decided to change careers midlife. And he went from, well, we thought it was midlife because we were like 28. But, it was like starting over, and he went from nursing to teaching. And with that change, our dreams of starting medical clinics around the world was really put on hold. Because we had some Arabic, he was eventually offered a teaching position in the Middle East, and so we packed our bags, and we have lived in the Middle East for the last 22 years. And for now, we live in Qatar, or as you Texans might say, Qatar. My husband teaches at the university, and I worked for many, many years in operations and HR management. So that's a little bit about what I want to tell you about myself, but I want to fast forward now to the spring of 2014. I was consulting in a high-profile education event in the Middle East. There were many prominent world leaders there, and it was the height of the refugee crisis. And for some reason, during that conference, much like this, I felt compelled to ask the Director General of UNESCO how I could get involved in helping refugees. And shortly after, I received my first invitation from the UN to visit the Zatari camp in Jordan. Now, at the time, it was the largest camp in the Middle East, and it was home to nearly 1 million refugees at the time. And this was the trip that changed my life, because here I met the desperate need of refugees face to face. They were no longer statistics on TV, but they were real people with real needs. And during this trip, I learned a lot. I learned that nearly all funds that are raised to help refugees go for things like water and housing and shelter and food. But less than 5% is dedicated to medical or education combined. And that was staggering and appalling for me. And I also visited other camps outside the UN camps. And in Jordan at the time, they were really makeshift tents in the middle of open fields. And there were thousands of refugees living like this. And this is where I knew that I wanted to help. But the problem was, I really had no idea how to help. So after my trip, I went home and I started to plan, and I started to make contacts within refugee environments in Jordan, in Lebanon, and I talked to ministries, I talked to government agencies about how I could get involved. But the process was super slow. Like, imagine trying to break into a new industry that you know nothing about. That's exactly what I was trying to do. But in the fall of 2015, I was absolutely stunned, like most of the world, by a small, lifeless body of a refugee boy that washed up on a sandy shore. It wasn't just a lifeless boy. This was Alan Kurdi, and his parents were fleeing an ISIS attack when their boat, designed for 8 but carrying 15 people, capsized in the Mediterranean Sea. Some of you might remember this on the news. How many of you saw this picture on the news? Yeah, it was one of those that really just changed my life. And I went from the planning phase to the I have to do something right now phase. I saw it and I knew that I'd heard enough. And so I decided to call a friend, Dr. Bridget Sterling. I had only known her for 3 months, but I asked her if she would join me on a trip to Jordan to see if we could do something to help refugees. So we each contributed $2,500. We boarded a flight to Jordan. It's just about 3 hours from where we live in Doha. And we started to meet with the contacts I had made in the year prior. And we visited medical clinics that were in the capital city, that were already run by doctors that worked with refugees. We even received an invitation from the Royal Palace. But I don't know if you believe in miracles or if you believe in chance, but we met skilled refugees that day. We met refugee doctors. We met refugee nurses. We met refugee pharmacists, and they all wanted to do something to help. We also met a group that had a licensed medical building about an hour outside the capital city, and they were just waiting for someone to come along and help them with this project. So with doctors and nurses and pharmacists, a building and a license, we launched our first clinic in just 4 days. Now that is nothing short of a miracle anywhere in the world, let alone the Middle East. So it was great. We treated more than 100 patients that week. Dr. Bashar, our first Iraqi refugee doctor, he led the way. And like so many that work with us, he's a refugee himself, but he volunteers his time to help because he wants to give back. And I'll tell you that we meet a lot of skilled refugees in the areas where we work right now. We meet doctors, we meet lawyers, and we meet people who are much more educated than I am. And they're all waiting to help. So after that, grand opening, 4 days, treat 100 patients, I was hooked. I knew that if we could do that much with a few $1,000s and we could treat 100 patients, we could do even more with a little more planning and a little more support behind us. I also realized that I was in way over my head because we had not anticipated starting a clinic in 4 days. So that's when I realized I really needed a nonprofit behind this work. It wasn't just a Melissa project anymore. And that's when Jeff and Mary Kinney, here tonight, they're presidents and founder of Tying Vines, they stepped up to the plate, and they have been with us ever since. They were here at this grand opening, and I'm so thankful for their support because they really make all the logistics behind the scenes possible, so thank you. Before my trip to the camps, I had always believed that someone else was helping refugees, someone like the UN or other agencies that work in the region. But sadly, that is just not the case. I meet these refugees in places like this along the Syrian border where they just eke out an existence. They are barely able to survive. In fact, the UN says that nearly 80% of all refugees live outside of sanctioned camps, at least in the areas where we work. And I call these camps some of the largest outdoor prisons in the world because these people are stuck here. Now, it's far from a short-term experience because most refugees have now surpassed the 5-year mark in exile. I was in this camp last week, and almost everyone I work with is now hitting the 8-year mark. Now, that's a long time to wait. That's a long time to be without hope. So imagine you fled war, and you get to safety, but you can't earn a living. You've been stripped of the ability to educate your kids or even legally work. Now, imagine you're stuck there for 5 or even 8 years. That's like having your life on hold since 2010. So no job, no schools, no medical care, no help. That's a very, very long time to live like this. So as I mentioned when I started, I learned a few things along this journey, a few things that surprised me over the last few years. And the first one is, when you're working with refugees and those who have so little, small actions can be transformative. The insignificant can be instrumental. And I know that much of the work we do might seem insignificant. I mean, we're just a small organization with a few medical clinics and a few education spaces. But it often feels like our small acts are nothing but a ripple in a very huge crisis. But I want to talk to you just a little bit about the ripple effects tonight, because how Aggie Build students help us engage in building community around the world is really transformational. It's not just about medical care or education. It's much, much bigger than that. So I want to tell you tonight a story about one woman I met. She's a woman who came to one of our clinics, and her name is Hayat. When I met her, she was being wheeled across the dirt in her wheelchair. I happened to snap this photo. And Hayat was crippled from birth because she had childhood polio. And so she was stripped of the ability to walk. But I'll tell you that she is probably the most bubbly spirit that I have ever met. And she made everyone in the camp laugh. She was coming across to see our doctor at this time. And for years, Hayat had dreamed of being a mother, and she was finally 8 months pregnant. But on this day, she was faced with the terrible, gut-wrenching news that the baby growing inside of her might have an abnormality that would prove fatal. So she was sad. And we had no idea what type of doctor she had seen or even if she had had any real tests done. Our doctor examined her, but he didn't know. So we left Hayat that day not knowing whether or not the news was true. A few months later, I was back in the same camp. And as I approached her door, I really just had to brace myself for what I might find. Because you know, sometimes in this area where we work, it's really difficult. And our stories do not always have happy endings. But before I went in to meet her, I took a deep breath, and then I saw her holding a perfectly healthy baby boy. She was probably the happiest and proudest mother that I have ever seen. And when I I took the baby from her and I began to cuddle him while she used her arms to drag herself around the tent. Now remember, she's crippled from polio. She's using her hands to drag herself around her tent so she can make tea for me. So we laughed and we visited, and it was really a happy time, but it was also so humbling to be served by a disabled refugee woman in the middle of a camp with her tent made of bed sheets and plastic. But she served us with a dignity that was truly inspiring. And as I handed the little boy back to her, and we started to say our goodbyes, I realized that now with her hands full, she couldn't even hardly move. And she used her arms to walk with her elbows as she carried her baby. And I decided right then and right there on the spot that I would do one small thing, like one tiny thing. And I would come back tomorrow with the baby carrier because I knew that it would change her life. Now, a baby carrier is not significant. It's $20 where we are. But when I returned the next day, her husband was there. And he was so proud. He put on the baby pack and he started to show it off to all the neighbors. And you know, this was one small, insignificant act. But it was an act that was transformational in the lives of this refugee family. And after that, other groups decided that they could help with baby packs too. And not only for disabled refugees, but for refugees who walk for miles for food or for health care. And so it became transformational. This is the ripple effect that I'm talking about. It started with Aggie Build, and then it came to us, and then it went to other groups who saw the pattern and knew that they could help. And what's amazing is that if we all do just a little piece, the whole becomes so much larger than the sum of its parts. And that brings me to the second thing that I've learned. Even in the darkest places, I find hope and laughter and joy. You know, I often get criticized by my friends and sometimes well-meaning groups. They tell me I post too many pictures of happy children. They wonder how people will support our work because my kids look happy. But I don't post random pictures. They're not pictures from kids down the block. These are kids and children that we know well that work with us in the camps. And even in the worst of circumstances, children have joy. They run to us at every camp. They hold our hands and we walk between their tattered tents and down the dirt pathways. And one day, I walked with this little guy. He's Mustafa. And he has an adorable grin and his sparkling eyes just touch me. We talked about his home in Syria, and he was just hilarious as he talked about how he remembered swinging in the park with his friends. Now, I love this boy. He's just a little bit like my boys, a little bit naughty as he jokes with me and tugs me along to meet his mother, joking about how slow I walk. But in the short exchange that I had with Mustafa, I would never, ever have imagined that this boy, this happy boy, watched his father die, trying to get his family to safety. I've learned that children are incredibly resilient. Where I work, they're all hungry, and many are sick, and more than I want to count, like little Mustafa, have watched their loved ones die. But it continually amazes me that they still laugh and they still play with an abandon that you can't even imagine. And that brings me to the third lesson that I learned. Every one of us can do something. Since the first trip a few years ago, we've gone way beyond just setting up medical clinics. We now have education programs and vocational training courses. We ship 40-foot containers of all kinds of supplies and food into war zones. And when I say we, I mean we. People just like you and just like me. Nobody's special, but we're all doing our little piece. So my relationship with the Aggie Build program started in 2016, I guess right when about the time you started. I didn't actually realize that until tonight. But I was talking to a friend, and she happened to be an Aggie. You know we find you all over the globe, right? So I was speaking to her, and I asked her how she thought I might engage university students in helping with our refugee projects. And so she suggested that I talk to Dr. Gordon Karstens. So the next time through, the next time through, I made an appointment to meet with Dr. Carstens and the Aggie Build team. And that was really when I realized that Aggie Build students were already way ahead of me. They were already making medical clinics for underprivileged areas. And that was the beginning of a partnership that has now benefited more than 27,000 refugees. Now that's incredible. That's impact. Every time that I've asked an Aggie for help, and I don't just ask you for medical clinics or education clinics, I actually ask you things all the time. I've asked you for engineering drawings so that we could retrofit some of our sites that we already have in Jordan and Lebanon and Iraq. And every time I've asked an Aggie student for help, they have responded with a resounding yes. I think we can help. Not only medical clinics, but they've just finished this amazing clinic or education site that I toured today, and I'm looking forward to using that in Jordan. It's just phenomenal what we can do together. Refugees have a need, I make a request, you build it, someone helps us ship it, Medical Bridges fills it full of stuff. So we just have incredible partners all along the way, and it was nice to see some of you honored here tonight. Now, on some level, I can relate to these children displaced by war. Because I came from a big family, we were a big dysfunctional Brady Bunch. My parents divorced when I was young, and we often moved from town to town. I was always the new kid trying to fit in, always the new girl on the block, trying to build community. And then I grew up and married my husband, and we moved overseas living as an expat in a foreign land, and that was just exponential. But by comparison, I had it easy. I had schools, I had a home, I had food, and I had the ability to work. So I want to ask you to do some things tonight, just some very, very simple things. First, I want you to recognize your own power. Because these big global problems, they might seem insurmountable, but they're not. We each have power, and when we use that power together, we can actually change the world, and we are changing the world. We are changing lives, and we are saving lives together. And second, I want to say, get involved, because we can each do something. Last spring, we hosted this Build team, and we saw a little bit of the video of it tonight. And I was really honored to meet Jerry Ebanks. He came and he dedicated the clinic in honor of his son, Michael. And I just want to say thank you, Jerry, for your selfless service. You are such an advocate for this program, and it was a very great honor to meet you and have you come and dedicate the clinic. So, thank you. So, Build students, they got involved, they saw a need, and they helped us launch this clinic. And I can tell you, we're not fully funded. Sometimes we just start projects because we have little money. And we started this project knowing that we only have it half funded for the year. So the clinic's open 2 days a week. But as it stands right now, we're treating more than 100 patients each week in this Aggie Build clinic alone. And when a clinic is at full capacity, it's really about 15,000 patients per year that we can see in one of these clinics. And that is a staggering number. I want to challenge you tonight to start asking yourself, how can I get involved? A little bit like I did back at the education conference. How can I get involved? Sometimes that's going, and sometimes that's giving, and sometimes that's just getting involved here at home. But we all have the ability to make a difference. I want to share one example of that, just to give you an idea. It was the spring of 2016, and I received a call from a businessman out of the blue I had never met. He lived in another country, and he asked if he could join me on a trip, actually to this camp. It's a camp along the Syrian border, and I had never been there, and I was going to backpack through the camp to kind of see what the needs were before we started our work there. And I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, so I wanted to tell him no because I had no idea what to expect. But on that day, I had the courage to say yes, and I just let him join the chaos. And here's what he had to say when we got to the camp. Let's see if I can do this one right. He said, "Before my trip with the refugees, They were not real to me. I saw them on social media and television along with dancing cats and Stranger Things. It was not until I was there, present with them, breathing their need, that they and their plight became real, and it shook me to the bone. At every moment, there are other humans out there who are deprived of hope, and the time I spent in camps helped me understand clearly what hope was by seeing the lack of it. One of the mothers I met thanked me for being there, for giving her and her children hope. I had never given anyone hope before, and this changed me. Now, I want to tell you, Brian has now become one of the biggest advocates for our programs. He loves what the Build students are doing. It's simple, it's cost-effective, and it's mobile, which is extremely important in a refugee environment. And because he loved it so much, he decided to dedicate his digital medical platform so we can now connect refugees who are sick with doctors and specialists anywhere in the world. And he also helps us champion the vision of reaching 700 camps worldwide. And that's a whole lot of camps. So Aggie Build students, I'm going to lay that challenge before you tonight. 700 camps worldwide. 700 camps. Even if you could take your spirit and your heart and we could reproduce it in other universities around the world, we could have an amazing impact in the world, doing very little on our own. So I lay that challenge before you tonight. And lastly, I want to ask each of you that are here tonight to just do something. You know, when I look around this room, I see a lot of potential for exponential impact. I'm sure Build students can share many more stories of the lives that they've impacted, and my hope is that tonight you'll get involved and you'll help them. Because when you help them, you help us, and we help others. And it's a link in a chain that we all need to be a part of. I've led more than 30 teams in the last 2 years, because I started about the time Build started. Fall of 2015, we launched our first clinic in 2016, January 2016. So we've been doing this the same amount of time. But I have to tell you that you don't have to do something big to have a really big impact. You just have to do something. So let's go back here to where we started. I'm high in the remote mountains of Iraq. I'm sitting in a room with men with machine guns, bulletproof vests, and I'm absolutely terrified. I'm sure you can imagine how scary that moment was for me. But then something changed, and the men began to take off their bulletproof vests and lay down their machine guns, and I realized in that moment that I wasn't in danger, even though I had no idea what was going on. And then women and children began to come back into the room, and they brought plates of food and things to drink. And I realized that these were the Peshmerga fighters who were bravely holding the lines against ISIS, and they had just returned to their village to eat lunch. I'll never, ever forget that moment. It's extreme fear and then extreme relief when you realize that you're not in danger. But moments like that, they bring a clarity of purpose like nothing else can. And do you want to know the most ironic thing that I learned in this remote mountain of Iraq? Aggies are there too, because I met them. And unbelievable, but while I was there that week, the Aggie Build Clinic arrived for this area, and I had no idea that an Aggie Build Clinic was going to this region. I just happened to be meeting with the same contact that you had, Billy Ray. So thank you for your selfless service. It's absolutely unbelievable that it reaches the uttermost parts of the earth. So Build students, I want to say, you are doing phenomenal work, so please keep it up. Keep up the good work, because what you're doing, it's changing the world. It's changed 27,000 lives since I met you 2 years ago. Your empathy and your hard work, they don't go unnoticed. I know that you do the kind of work behind the scenes that's rarely rewarded openly. And I also know that all schools have core values. I've been around the education scene for a long time, but I have rarely ever seen core values translated into such concrete service that it transforms lives around the world. So thank you. You should be proud of what you're doing. I've already talked to you about where we work in Iraq and Yemen and Jordan and Lebanon, but I'm going to throw out the challenge again tonight that I would love to work with you in many more countries to help those who are underprivileged. So my experiences, even those in the mountains of Iraq, they change you. They changed me. And they've made me braver, they've made me stronger, they've made me wiser. But I'm not as scared now of stepping into new territory, and I'm definitely not as afraid of failure, because I know that even if we fail, we're failing forward in a way that helps those that are less fortunate. So I want to say tonight, please remember that every one of us can do something. Small acts change lives, and get involved, because I promise it will change your life as much as the lives that you help. Thank you.